Hello, everyone. So, I've been asked to talk about the light old topic of anti Semitism, Jew hatred. For a bit of background, I'm Ollie. I run an online Jewish channel called JTV. And when I was asked to talk about this, I think part of the reason is because many people, particularly in the West, who are sane, sensible, moral individuals, are looking at what's happening in the Middle East and probably a little bit baffled, thinking, what's going on? Why is it, first of all, that Israel seems to be deemed as the bad guy in all of this? She faces a war on multiple fronts, is clearly, if you zoom out, the underdog, the one being victimized. She's facing jihadist, ideological, extremist hatred that isn't really bothered by occupation of a small part of the land, but doesn't want to have any Jewish state, any Jewish presence, any Jewish survival at all. And yet, when she defends herself, she is seen as the bad guy. The whole thing has been completely inversed. It is moral perversion. And then on top of that is the very fact that so much focus seems to be on Israel. And it's just so bizarre to many people. I don't understand. There are so many more conflicts. There are so many more issues of land displacement. People often say that what happens in Israel, the reason for all this going on is because of the displacement that occurred in 1948 of the Arabs. A displacement that occurred, by the way, only because the Arab armies wanted to try and annihilate Israel. And the displacement occurred after. But many, many more people were displaced in the India-Pakistan separation. Much more displacement and death, and no one seems to be focused on that. Today, just in the past few years, so many more tragedies, so many more civilian deaths in the Syrian civil war, Sudan, in Iraq, think about what's happening in Iran and the kind of human rights atrocities taking place there. Not to mention the Uyghur atrocities happening to Uyghur Muslims in China. There's more people that have died in the Syrian civil war in the past decade than have in all of Israel's wars against the Arabs since her founding in 1948. Go figure. Israel has the lowest civilian to combatant ratio in the history of urban warfare. It was higher when we in the West faced battles against ISIS, like, for example, the Battle of Mosul. And yet Israel is called a genocider. Meanwhile, most of the Arabs polled in Gaza or in Judea and Samaria, also known as the West Bank, an attempt to try and de-Judaize an ancient Jewish land, most of the Arabs there, still to this day, according to polling done by Palestinian polling companies, support October 7th, support the genocide that took place. That's a real genocide. And so many people are looking and thinking, what's going on here? We can't explain this simply as just a normal, sane response. The fact that there are people, whether it's media, I don't, by the way, think it's the majority of people, I just think it's the people leading this that's stirring up all this hatred, but whether it's in the media, politicians, NGOs, the UN, or others, or people with vested interests, there is a clear, disproportionate focus on Israel. We often hear this word disproportionate bandied around. Israel's acting disproportionately while she's trying to save her own people. Actually, the disproportionality is the focus on Israel. And this, of course, brings into question what's really going on here. And that's why I think people then turn to say, well, maybe this is actually about something a little bit deeper than just a land dispute. Maybe, just maybe, the fact that there is one country, of all the countries out there in the world, there is only one country whose very existence is brought into question, whose very existence needs justification. Is it just a coincidence that it happens to be the Jewish one? Is it just a coincidence that if you look at the United Nations resolutions that are resolutions condemning a country, attacking a country, that Israel has more UN General Assembly resolutions against her than all other countries combined in recent years? I think that's from the past decade. And you want to tell me that this and the intense focus on Israel and Israel's very existence being brought into question, it's just fair game? When people attack Russia, what they did in Ukraine, they don't say Russia has lost the right to exist or I'm anti-Russia. They say I'm anti-Putin. But only with Israel, they say they're anti-Israel. Many people, many sensible people say, actually, this probably has something more to do with that age-old problem that's existed for as long as the Jews have been around, the issue of anti-Semitism. And that's what I wanted to explore today with you, to see if we can get to the root of what's really going on here. What is anti-Semitism really all about, if that's what it is, if that's what's going on here, which I think, given what I was saying at the start, given how disproportionate the focus is on Israel, how unfair, how much there are double standards against Israel, I think it becomes clear that this is about, ultimately, the fact that it's the Jews and that age-old hatred, anti-Semitism. So let's talk about anti-Semitism. It really has been there since the Jewish people first became a nation. In fact, even in the Bible, the Torah, as the Jewish people call it, when the Jews are first referred to as a nation in the book of Exodus, when they first become a people, literally the very next verse, the very next sentence, Pharaoh, who is ruling over them at the time, says, we've got to wipe them out. We've got to get rid of them because maybe they'll come and become too numerous and try to overthrow us. And the language he uses is very dehumanizing. It's amazing how it's all there. In fact, I did a video on JTV a while back about the parallels between the tactics of Pharaoh and the tactics of the Nazis, and how there's these very eerie parallels. For example, the dehumanization, the denying of the crimes of genocide that they committed, the welcoming them into the country first and allowing for some level of assimilation and then turning their backs on them, the telling them that they should just work, Arbeit macht frei, work will set you free to work, and that, but really it's just a way of trying to totally demoralize them. There's a lot of parallels, but the point is we see it all the way back to its origins, the Jewish people's origins. Keep going, you look at the ancient empires that would attack and persecute the nascent Jewish state, ancient Jewish sovereign kingdoms that existed thousands of years ago. We're talking about, the times of King David and King Solomon and the 12 tribes settling in the land. And then soon after, when they establish their temple, they have the Babylonians come in, destroy their temple, invade. This is a foreign occupier coming in. You have the Assyrians. Later, when the Jews re-establish their temple, you then have the Greeks coming along and ransacking the temple. And then the Jews manage to stave off the Greeks and re-establish some level of sovereignty. But ultimately, what happens is that the ancient Romans, the Roman Empire, comes to the land and totally destroys Jewish sovereignty, destroys their second temple for good. And the Jews are dispersed and expelled from the land, and they face terrible persecution and murder and enslavement and rape and kidnapping and all the rest of it. And that begins their period where they move into parts of the Arab world and Europe. So I remember seeing this Family Guy clip a while back showing the Jews, the ancient Jews in Egypt, doing the hard labor and work of building the Egyptian cities. And one Jewish slave says to the other, all peoples have a rocky start to begin with, but don't worry, after this Egyptian enslavement, in our history, it's going to be plain sailing. And of course it isn't. Next up, you have Jews facing Christian anti-Semitism, because there was this narrative that was, I'm not going to say the cause of anti-Semitism, but was perhaps used to fuel the fire of anti-Semitism, which was that the Jews are rejected by God, or they need to be punished until they accept Christ, etc., etc. And so there was very serious persecution from the Catholic Church. We had the Crusades. They had all kinds of restrictions on Jews, dehumanizing them in Christian Europe. Similarly, with the rise of Islam, there was a similar narrative about the Jews being, Islam having the final word of God, and therefore Jews and other infidels need to be persecuted, and Jews didn't accept this idea of the Quran being the final word of God, and that of course led to quite a lot of persecution in the Muslim world. And actually in some ways it's really become far more magnified in recent years. One of its culminations was actually in 1948 when Israel was established. Jews from so many Arab countries were expelled. In fact, there were more Jews that were expelled from Arab Muslim countries than there were Arabs that were displaced in Israel, or what was then British Mandate Palestine, or what controlled by the UN in the interim year. And yet no one talks about these refugees, these Jewish refugees. Israel resettled them, of course. And so then that's another form of anti-Semitism you have. Then there's also a secularist form of anti-Semitism. We see, as the Enlightenment emerges, we see, unfortunately, there are some figures that call for embracing Jews and enfranchising them, but there are others that are very hostile to the Jews, culminating, of course, in the Nazi Holocaust. Of course, before that, there were incidents of the Russian pogroms and other massacres that occurred in Eastern Europe. But we had, with the Holocaust, perhaps the culmination of many thousands of years of anti-Jewish narratives that permeated Europe, and many historians believe it was really impossible for Hitler to do what he did without that backdrop. And we saw 1/3 of the Jewish people wiped out, 2/3 of European Jewry, I think well over 90% of Polish Jewry annihilated in a governmental, meticulous and incredibly complex, systematic industrial annihilation of a people. Truly, truly appalling. And now we see another form of anti-Semitism emerging. We've seen, as I say, it's been on the right, it's been on the left. Certainly there was persecution of Jews in communist and Soviet Union and communist countries. But we're seeing today a new kind of anti-Semitism in the aftermath of the Holocaust, with the re-establishment of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. And that is a sort of what calls itself anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. And that pulls together people on the left and the West, radicalized people in the Muslim world, the Arab world, people in the Far East who want to see, basically align themselves with any movements which can help hasten the West's, what they perceive as will be the West's destruction. And this is what we're seeing today. They say I'm not against the Jews, but I'm just against Zionism. Zionism, let's be clear, is nothing short of just the Jews being able to live. That's what it's about. The Jews being able to live in their ancient homeland. Jews in Israel aren't thinking, I'm a Zionist, I'm philosophically... They don't think, they're just Jews. These are Jews living in... Of course, they believe in Zionism, but these people aren't deep philosophical, politically aligned people. They're just Jews living as Jews in their land. And people that are against that, especially given the Jewish people's history of being in other people's countries and not being treated particularly well at times, although I'd certainly say, by the way, England in the last few hundred years has certainly been an exception to that rule overall. Although let's remember that throughout their time in Europe prior to, let's say, the Enlightenment, there were regular expulsions from countries, the Spanish Inquisition. You'd have the expulsion from England in the 1200s. There was various pogroms that took place in England, unfortunately, in that era. But nonetheless, the point is that people that say they're anti-Zionist, either they are so ignorant of Jewish history, both in terms of their connection to the land of Israel and also the experience Jews have had in exile, or frankly, they just don't really care about Jewish life, and they are anti-Semitic. So I really don't make any distinction between the two. So part of what makes anti-Semitism and the story of the Jews so baffling to historians, and why they find it such a unique hatred, is really for four key reasons. The first is its universality. It seems to be that wherever Jews go or don't go, they face a hostility. By the way, less so in the Eastern world, less so in the East, and we'll touch on why that might be later, because there are some important reasons. And by the way, I'm not also trying to say there haven't been times of, good moments in Jewish history in exile, but it has been overall something that's where anti-Semitism has cropped up. Then secondly is its longevity, the fact that anti-Semitism has gone on for as long as the Jews have been around. It's a age-old sickness and hatred. And then it's intensity, the fact that there's a whole library of words just to describe anti-Semitism, whether it's the ghettos that were introduced in Europe to box in Jews and stop them from integrating into wider society. Pogrom, blood libels, the blood libels that were libels said about Jews to try and make them guilty of drinking the blood of Christian babies to make their Passover matzah. So it's those kind of things. We've got, as I mentioned before, the Inquisition, Holocaust. There's so many words to talk about what's taken place in terms of anti-Semitism. And then irrationality, the fact that Jews have been hated not just for irrational reasons, but often contradictory reasons as well. So think about it. You had at times Jews being told we hate them because it's sort of like a punching up. Like Jews are all powerful and they're controlling, and they're this elite that they are running the world and controlling the weather and all these things, and we need to get rid of them because they're a threat to us. And then at other times it can be a punching down. We hate Jews because they're inferior and they're scum of the earth and they're etc. etc. We hate Jews because they're rich or because they're poor and inferior. We hate Jews because they killed Jesus. We hate Jews because they created Christianity. We hate Jews because they're parasites on our state. We hate Jews because they created their own nation state. The reasons can be so often just irrational. We find with other hatreds, there can usually be the same old stereotypes over and over and over again, or it usually serves a function. So, for example, we'd see size hatred against black people and persecution against them. It's the same old tropes that are used to justify basically just in enslaving them, what we've seen in Western countries for their own purposes. But with Jews, it's often, as I said, contradictory reasons. We hate Jews because they created communism. We've heard that before, and they're all communists. Or we hate Jews because they're evil capitalists. Think Jeremy Corbyn and that mural and all the rest of it. So it's clear that when we see excuses being given for why they hate, but they're often different, that means we haven't really got to the root of what's going on, that these are often just excuses rather than actual causes. So I've explained to you what it is that makes anti-Semitism so unique. We've spoken about in a sort of a brief overview of the history of anti-Semitism to date. And now I'd like to talk to you about the theories that are proposed to kind of explain anti-Semitism, to explain what it is that is driving this. And I'd like to go through 7 theories with you, all of which I actually consider to be insufficient. They don't really explain what the root cause of anti-Semitism is, and I'll show you why. So the first theory is the economic theory. We hate Jews because they possess too much wealth and power. Now, many people say this explains it. It's resentment towards the Jews for their success, etc., and that's what drives anti-Semitism. I think that definitely is part of the dynamics of what's going on here. But the problem with this is that there have been times in Jewish history where we would see vehement anti-Semitism and the Jews being dirt poor. For example, the Jews in the Pale of Settlement in Russia in between the 17th to 20th century and Eastern Europe, they were really not well off. They were not the most successful group by any means, and yet they faced pogroms, they faced massacres, So it's just not a consistent, clean theory. Secondly, the argument is the chosen people argument. We hate Jews because they arrogantly claim they are the chosen people, and that's why Jews are hated. The problem with this, again, is that in Germany, many other Enlightenment countries, from the 19th century onwards, Jews totally assimilated. They rejected, well, not really rejected, they just weren't interested in their Judaism and Jewish religion. They tried to totally assimilate and become more German than the Germans. There was a saying of some Jewish groups, Berlin is our New Jerusalem. And yet, what happened with the Nazis? They said, you're trying to basically be like us, and we don't accept you for doing that. Secondly, the other problem I have with the chosen people thing is that, the other two great monotheistic religions, Christianity and Islam, also profess to be chosen. They say we have the New Testament, or Muslims say we have the final word of God. We are the new inheritors of the chosen people mission to bring the voice of God to the world. We are the new chosen people. In fact, in Christianity and Islam, they both say that you need to follow our religion to get to heaven and have salvation. Judaism never said that. Judaism doesn't say that you need to be Jewish in order to have a relationship with God, to go to heaven, to be blessed and all that. Absolutely not. It just means that for Jews, they have a specific role. Also, many countries have a sense of being chosen. There's many people have had a real sense of belief in their being special, being chosen by God. Too many to mention. Particularly, by the way, the founders of America really had a sense of believing that they were sort of creating the new promised land. So again, doesn't really stack up, this sense of Jews think they're somehow, better, special, whatever. Then the third one is the scapegoat theory. The scapegoat theory is Jews are a convenient group to single out and blame for our troubles. Now, again, sounds very compelling. Yeah, they're just the easy scapegoat, useful for politicians to say, let's hate these people. Again, I do think it does have a grain of truth to them, but the problem is with this, that is that in order to scapegoat a group of people, they need to already be hated to some degree. So, for example, if Hitler would have said, well, it's the bicycle riders and the midgets that are causing all our problems, do you think he would have had the same success in getting as many voters and getting as many people riled up against them? I don't think so. So I don't think it's a clean theory. Then we have the theory of deicide. Jews are hated because they killed Jesus. Well, some problems with this. First of all, the Bible says the Romans did it. And where's the anti-Roman feeling? Far from it. You had the Roman Catholic Church. Secondly, Jesus said, forgive them for they know not what they do. And even the Vatican, by the way, in 1963 exonerated the Jews officially for this. But also, let's say it was one or two people that betrayed Jesus. That doesn't suddenly mean you blame all Jews forever. That's just not a logical thing. The same way that they don't blame all the Romans, let alone any, for what happened to Jesus and him being crucified. So again, it simply doesn't make sense. Also, we see many other types of anti-Semitism that aren't to do with Christianity and that aren't from Christian sources. Then there's the outsiders theory. Jews are hated because they're different from us, or the dislike of the unlike. But again, as I've said before, Enlightenment Jews, many of them rushed to assimilate. And the Nazis were basically saying, stop trying to become like us. You're trying to infiltrate us and we don't like it. So that theory also is problematic. Then there's the racial theory. Jews are hated because they are an inferior race. But part of the problem with that is that Jews actually aren't a race. Anyone can become Jewish. Yes, Jews do stem from one particular ethnic group, from one particular original group of tribes and a nation, but people can join the Jews, so it simply isn't a racial theory. And then there's the Zionism one. Jews are hated because they created or recreated a sovereign state in the land of Israel. Let's be clear, by the way, that the whole notion that Jews are in any way foreign occupiers of Palestine, the term Palestine itself is a European colonial term created by the Romans to sever the ancient Jewish connection to the land. And any concern of displacement that people say occurred by the Arabs, it was not something that, like Israel and the Jews did, they just came there and kicked everyone out. No, they were there. All living there legally, having acquired land legally, returning there after their 2,000-year exile, always maintaining a presence there in the land, by the way. And then the UN said, well, we've got Jews here, there are Arabs here, so let's split the land. And the Jews said, fine. And the Arabs said, no, we want all of it. They didn't have any sovereign state prior to that, Arab sovereign state there. But they said, no, the Jews can't even have a tiny sliver of land. And they went to war. And in that war, many of them got displaced. Largely, actually, according to their own leaders, because the Arab armies said to the Arabs, leave and come back once we've killed the Jews. So it's absurd that Jews are held accountable for people trying to annihilate them, but it's all part and parcel of anti-Semitism. But the theory of Zionism being the cause for anti-Semitism really doesn't stack up, aside from all of that, because of the fact that anti-Semitism has existed far longer than the modern state of Israel has existed. So the conclusion is that none of these stack up as helpful theories. Now, I'm going to tell you what I consider to be what's really going on here. It's not something that I can sort of, prove to you comprehensively through, like some kind of mathematical equation, but it's something that I think you can make a very strong case for, and that I think, given the fact that all other options don't really stack up, it has to be something pointing to this. And what I'm really going to bring up is a spiritual element, a deeper element than from what we can see to the naked eye. Because the problem is that all naturalistic explanations simply don't add up. They don't explain the severe determination of the anti-Semites throughout history, the hang-up they have with the Jews to try and annihilate them. We've seen so many nations and empires come and go. The Romans, the Babylonians, the Greeks, Spanish Empire, the British Empire, the Soviets, the Nazis, and so many of them had an issue with the Jews. And yet they have risen and fallen, and the Jewish people remain. We had Hitler, who was prepared to divert train tracks, taking his soldiers to the Eastern Front to fight the Russians in the final stages of World War II, where he was clearly losing, in order to send more Jews to the gas chambers. He said, behind Britain and France and all the Allies is the Jews. What made these people so caught up with Jew hatred? And I'm sorry, but I simply don't think that naturalistic explanations cut it or explain it. And many historians are baffled by anti-Semitism. Look at the people that study Jewish history that talk about it. They also sense that you have to go deeper. You have to go into the supernatural element. When we talk about the supernatural element, the first thing I'd point to is quite simply that the Bible itself talks about this, prophesizes that such a phenomenon will occur. It says in Deuteronomy that when the Jews are going to inevitably be scattered and exiled around the world, it says, quote, "And among those nations you shall find no respite, and there will be no rest for your foot. And God will give you a trembling heart and wasted eyes and a dismayed spirit." And we talk about in the Passover literature, Jews raise a cup of wine and they say every single year, in every nation, our enemies rise up to destroy us, but God saves us from their hand. It's embedded, as I said to you before. Pharaoh himself, at the start of Jewish history, kicks off the story of anti-Semitism. It's really as old as the Jewish people are, and it's something that is clearly deeper than, as I said, a naturalistic explanation. Anne Frank said in her diary on April 11th, 1944, so this would have been one of her last entries, she wrote, "Who knows, it might even be our religion from which the world and all peoples learn good, and for that reason and that reason alone do we now suffer. We can never become just Netherlanders or just English or representatives of any other country for that matter. We will always remain Jews." Anne Frank actually believed that it's not really about Jews per se. It's actually about Judaism and what Judaism represents. And for that, we have to go a bit deeper, a bit more spiritual. Let me say this next, which is that the Talmud itself, which is an ancient Jewish biblical commentary. It's a book of Jewish law and philosophy. It's many, many books actually, and it's ancient. It's thousands of years old. It talks about Jew hatred. It talks about anti-Semitism, and for them, the rabbis of ancient times were very clear on what's really going on with anti-Semitism. It says, what is the source of anti-Semitism? What is the source of the hatred? The Hebrew word for hatred in Hebrew is sinah. And the word for Mount Sinai is pronounced Sinai, and the words Sinai and Sinah are very similar. And the rabbis say there's a reason for that. They sort of do a play on words, and they say that the hatred of the anti-Semites throughout history emanates from Sinai. What do they mean by that? Well, of course, Mount Sinai, if you're not familiar with the story, that is the moment where God comes to the Jewish people who have recently been liberated from enslavement of the Egyptians, and they receive the Ten Commandments and the Torah, the Bible, the moral diktats of God, the moral vision of the kind of world that the God of Israel wishes to have for the entire world. And they're given this very mission to spread it to the world. And the rabbis are saying that anti-Semitism at its core is really a resistance, a rebellion, a resentment of that mission, of those values. I want to read to you some quotes to talk about what it is that this Mount Sinai moment and all the values that flow from the Bible has done for our world, because some people aren't so clear about that. They don't really appreciate the extent to which the values of the Bible have so permeated our world. This is Thomas Cahill, who wrote a book called The Gifts of the Jews, a non-Jewish historian. He said, I believe non-Jewish, he said, quote, "The Jews started it all, and by it I mean so many of the things we care about, the underlying values that make all of us, Jew and Gentile, believer and atheist, tick. Without the Jews, we would see the world through different eyes." Leo Tolstoy, the Russian philosopher, author, writer, said, "The Jew is the symbol of eternity. He is the one for who so long had guarded the prophetic message and transmitted it to all mankind. A people such as this can never disappear. The Jew is eternal. He is the embodiment of eternity." If we think about so many of the values that you and I hold dear today, the value of human life, all human life being sacred, the notion that world peace is an ideal, the notion of family values and families being the basic building block of a healthy society, the notion of equality and justice before the law, that we should all be treated equally before the law, whether you're poor or the king, notions of social responsibility to the poor and the needy, the notion of education as a human right for all. These values, where did they come from? Well, we're told that the Western world is built on the pillars of ancient Rome and ancient Greece. Did you see many of those values practiced in the ancient world, in those ancient empires? Did you see much value of human life in the gladiator stadiums? Did you see world peace as an ideal from their cultures that glorified war? Did you see the idea of family values being essential when sexual promiscuity was so common and celebrated? Did you see the notion of justice and equality before the law and education as a human right practiced in those imperial entities when they actually tried to be very elitist so they could protect their power from being enfranchised to the masses? Did you see much social responsibility to the poor and the needy, where the vulnerable and the weak were left to their own devices to suffer and to fall apart? No. It is actually, I don't think there's enough of an appreciation in the West, in particular, for how much the values that so many of us hold dear come from the Hebrew Bible. And people that assume, well, I would just have them anyway. Well, why do you assume that? Because other societies, certainly of prior eras, did not have that. And many people then say, well, it was the secular democratic revolutions that brought those values. It was not the Bible that brought those values to the world. And to which I say, well, why don't we analyze the four great revolutions of the Western world? We had the English and American revolutions, and then the French and the Russian. The French and the Russian led to blood and terror. The English and the American led to prosperity, democracy, equality before the law, and a respect for the value of human life and success. Now, which of those were based on religious values and ideas, and which of those were based on atheist, secularistic ideas? The Russian and the French were on the latter, and the English and the American were on the former. In fact, John Adams, the second president of America, said, quote, "I will insist the Hebrews have contributed more to civilized men than any other nation. If I was an atheist and believed in blind eternal fate, I should still believe that fate had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations. They are the most glorious nation that ever inhabited this earth. The Romans and their empire were but a bubble in comparison to the Jews. They've given religion to 3/4 of the globe and have influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other nation, ancient or modern." And I can also quote to you Paul Johnson, who wrote a book, The History of the Jews. And he said, "To them we owe the idea of equality before the law, both divine and human, of the sanctity of life and dignity of the human person, of the individual conscience and so of personal redemption, of collective conscience and of social responsibility, of peace as an abstract ideal, love as the foundation of justice, and many other items which constitute the basic moral furniture of the human mind. Without the Jews it might have been a much emptier place. Above all, the Jews taught us how to rationalize the unknown. The result was monotheism and the 3 great religions which profess it. It is almost beyond our capacity to imagine how the world would have fared if they had never emerged." And I actually want to quote to you a line from Margaret Thatcher, who said on July the 14th, 1989, when France celebrated 200 years of the beginning of the French Revolution, Thatcher, who was Prime Minister at the time, was in the middle of a press conference concerning Britain's economics. And I heard this reported, I've been trying to verify it, but I heard this reported by someone, that a reporter asked, "Mrs. Prime Minister, do you have a message today for the French people?" Mrs. Thatcher replied, "I don't know where the French people take credit for giving the world freedom, brotherhood and equality, liberté, égalité, fraternity. If I'm not mistaken, the Jewish people gave it to the world some 3,000 years prior to the French Revolution." And the great irony, by the way, is that the United Nations, which so often lambasts Israel, has on its wall a quote from Isaiah in New York, quoting the passage that says it's a vision for world peace, first articulated in the Hebrew Bible by Isaiah, who says, "Nation shall not lift sword against nation, neither shall they practice war anymore." It's so clear that it was the Jewish people who first articulated so many of these values to the world. And now that we understand this, we can have a better understanding of anti-Semitism. If you think about these values, and then you think about the ideologies, individuals that have led the charge against the Jews, can you not clearly see how they so clearly are at odds with one another? That you very rarely will see ideological alignment between Jews and their enemies, or at least Judaism and its enemies. And I think that really is the point. It can be a whole host of reasons that people feel motivated against the Jews. But it seems that I think what's going on is at a deeper level, perhaps subconscious for some, although not the greatest anti-Semites. It is more a rebellion against the ideas, the values, the concepts that Judaism and the Jews are charged with bringing to the world. When we think of the great anti-Semites throughout history, the one that is perhaps the most famous of them all would be Adolf Hitler. Now, what was Hitler all about? What was his driving mission? Why was he so obsessed with ridding the world of the Jews? Well, for him, he believed that we needed to create a hierarchical society based on superior and inferior, particularly around race. And he wanted a world where we were no longer shackled by the forces of morality and conscience, which he meant to sort of civilize us and make us care for the weak and the vulnerable. But he saw that as imprisoning us from being operating according to the laws of the jungle. For us being just like animals, where might is right and the strong dominate and the weak are crushed. Where we can be totally succumbing to all our desires, drives, and impulses. And basically, he wanted to have survival of the fittest. And the Jews, in his mind, were the people that were crippling his vision, that were the enemies of that vision, that were, as I say, arguing for all of those morals. And don't just take my word for it. This is his own words. This is what Hitler said in a conversation with Hermann Rauschning, who was someone that was allied with Hitler and then eventually changed sides and worked for the Allies. He quoted Hitler as saying, "Providence has ordained that I should be the greatest liberator of humanity. I'm freeing man from the restraints of an intelligence that has taken charge, from the dirty and degrading self-mortification of a false vision, a Jewish invention called conscience and morality, and from the demands of a freedom and independence which only a very few can bear. The 10 Commandments have lost their validity. Conscience is a Jewish invention. It is a blemish like circumcision. The struggle for world domination is fought entirely between us, between the Germans and the Jews. Everything else is but deception." And this was a Hitler Youth song they sang, which was, "We are the joyous Hitler Youth. We do not need any Christian virtue. Our leader is our savior. The Pope and the rabbi shall be gone. We want to be pagans once again." Now, this is someone who is the epitome of Jew hatred, but I believe that you can see this hostility to who the Jews are, to their particular mission that you can see demonstrated throughout history as being something they have carried out. The hostility to that mission is so clearly a driving force in anti-Semitism. It's an inability to accept this particular role the Jews have in history. And from a Jewish philosophical standpoint, this makes sense, because as a Jew, and observant Jews believe that when you understand what this mission is, it's basically a values-driven mission that is trying to bring the values of God, or the vision that God has for the world, into all of humanity and the world. And therefore, those who are hostile to that, who are hostile to wanting that kind of world, or find it bothersome or far too morally demanding, are going to say, "Get out of this world. Go back into the spiritual realm. You don't belong here on earth, whether you're in our territory or whether you're in what you think is your own country." And I think that really explains why there is this obsession with Jews having just one tiny sliver of land, one tiny bit of existence. Because it's so clearly what it is that the Jews represent to the entire world. Judaism believes that God desires a relationship with all humanity and uses the Jews really as a vehicle for bringing that vision and that desire for a relationship with the world to all mankind. And I think it is much more understandable, anti-Semitism, when you look at things through that lens. I think it's really the only way that you can give it coherent explanation. I want to finish by reading to you the last paragraph of this book, Why the Jews, written by Dennis Prager and Joseph Telushkin, because he concludes the very same thing. It's a great book, and I recommend getting it, where they go through all different types of Jew hatred and looks at what makes it unique and what it is that can be done. And he finishes by saying that, quote, "Jew hatred and its latest incarnation, Israel hatred, are the price Jews pay for their role in history. They pay it often unwillingly, and they pay it often unwillingly, and they live the role, for the most part, unwittingly. But as the great French Catholic theologian Jacques Maritain noted, Israel is to be found at the very heart of the world structure, stimulating it, exasperating it, moving it, like an alien body, like an activating ferment injecting into the mass. It gives the world no peace, it bars slumber. It teaches the world to be discontented and restless as long as the world has not God. It stimulates the movement of history. It is the vacation of Israel which the world hates. And moral non-Jews who do not heed the universal implications of this hatred are destined to be its victims. I think that word unwittingly is so poignant because both for Jews and non-Jews, it can be hard to understand why it is that this tiny, tiny people, only 15 million of them, smaller than what they were before the Holocaust, or having just about made up those numbers, a tiny, tiny people where so much of the world's attention is on it. The only way that you can really make sense of it, I believe, is by going deeper. And I know there may be some people who disagree with that, and I welcome people's comments and thoughts on how they would otherwise explain it. But to me, there is something so clearly unique here that can't be explained through naturalistic means. We have all kinds of hatreds out there, but this one is annihilationist. This one is an exterminationist kind of hatred that I don't think we see in other kinds of hatreds. And the reason for that is because of what the Jews ultimately represent, in my view. And the fact is, if you look at the people that have been most hateful to the Jews, whether it's now the leaders of Hamas, Hezbollah, the Iranian Ayatollah, or anti-Semitic despots of ancient times, it becomes clear that they represent dark, evil ideologies and ideas that need to be extinguished. And it is the values that so many of us who are watching this and try to live lives of morality believe are good and moral values. It is those values that were so often first articulated as a coherent structure by the Bible, by the Torah. And therefore, the fact that they turn to the Jews as their enemy, these anti-Semites, shows us what's really going on here. It should make us realize, therefore, how important it is, now more than ever, to be standing with Israel, to be standing on the side of what is right and what is decent and what is moral, and to explain and understand that, yes, it is moral to retaliate against those seeking to destroy you, and that even if there are people who aren't directly involved in the fighting that are killed when you're trying to target those terrorists and those evil people, that the moral responsibility lies with those who start this war, who start to act aggressively towards you, and that they are accountable for that, and that it is immoral to say, well, because some non-combatants on your side might die, therefore I'm just not going to fight and basically commit suicide. That is not moral. Now more than ever, all of us should understand that this really is a battle between good ideas and evil ideas. And I intentionally say ideas because I do believe, and I think Jewish tradition really believes, that people as individuals can change their ways. They can understand truth from falsehood. But it's only if we have the kind of moral courage to say, just because many people believe in something, I'm not necessarily going to go ahead with the crowd, go and side with the herd. Instead, I'm actually going to dig deeper and try to understand what is true. That has been the Jewish way throughout the centuries. The Jews, despite being often few in number, Abraham himself, the first Jew, was mocked and laughed at for his ideas. But we don't believe that truth is about democracy. Truth is truth regardless. And therefore, I encourage all of you to do your digging, search for the truth with all your heart and all your mind, and then to courageously stand up for it. It will be challenging, but ultimately very, very rewarding in the end. If you've made it so far in this video, I have a request for you. JTV has been having a really big impact in spreading the truth about Israel and creating positive associations with the Jewish people, Judaism, and Israel. We've really grown a lot, particularly in the last year, and we're having a really significant impact, both for Jews and non-Jews. But I really want to take JTV to the next level so we can start to compete with the other big online media beasts that are often peddling anti-Israel content. And the way we're going to do that is to scale even faster. So I'd love to build a team where we have other presenters doing shows like me, that start doing documentaries, supplementary content, animated content, etc., etc. And to do that, I'd like to build a bit of a team. So what we're going to do is we're going to do one fundraising day, just one, where we try and build up some funding in order to fund such a team. Now, to do that, it's going to obviously require people to get involved. And I'm wondering if you would consider, if you're watching JTV content and appreciate what we do and want to help partner with us in taking this to the next level and spreading the truth farther and wider than ever before, I wonder if you'd consider partnering with us simply by running a mini page on the fundraiser that we do, where you just reach out to your contacts on that day that we choose to fundraise and see if they'll all chip in. If you'd be up for doing that, of which I would be so grateful, then please click on the Google form link in the video description of this video, where you can simply just put in a few contact details. It'll be a very small commitment, as I say, literally just one day that we'll all agree upon as a collective community. But the impact is going to be so big. There's such strength in numbers. If we all pull together and do this, we can take this to the next level. And as I say, all of us can partner together in bringing and spreading the truth to the whole world. So please do consider clicking on that link, filling in the form, and I'll be in touch very soon to talk about the next steps. Small commitment, but a big impact. Hi, thank you so much for watching. To watch another one, click here. To stay up to date with all our content, click here to subscribe. And if you're able to, you can help support JTV to grow and grow by clicking join below this video, where you can become a member and get perks including early access to videos and private live discussions with me. But most of all, you'll be partnering with us on our mission to change the world.